Hello again. We're all of us familiar with Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's radio broadcast on September the 3rd, 1939, in which he solemnly declared to the British people that they were now at war with Germany. The following day saw the first fatal casualty in Britain of the Second World War, a man of whom nobody today has ever heard. Police Constable George Rodney Southworth. His death is of interest because it was in a sense one of many thousands which were deliberately and callously inflicted upon the nation by their government. During the Zeppelin and Goethe raids, the Goethe aeroplanes, more commonly called by British people Gothas, of the First World War, limited blackouts have been imposed in London. These were only a pale foreshadowing of the real thing, which was to be rigorously instituted 48 hours before the declaration of war in September 1939. The cry of "put that light out" is of course a familiar one to many people who were not even born when the Second World War began. It was immortalised by Bill Pertwee playing the part of Air Raid Warden Hodges in the popular television situation comedy Dad's Army. For anybody living in Britain between 1939 and 1945, there was nothing in the least comical or amusing about the blackout. At best, it was a constant nuisance. At worst, a deadly hazard. Every window of every building, not only in cities but everywhere else, had to be covered in material which prevented even a chink of light from showing. Cars had to drive without lights. There were no street lamps. Even striking a match to light a cigarette out of doors was frowned upon. It was actually a criminal offence under the blackout regulations to display a lit cigarette during an air raid. More than one hapless smoker was accused of signalling to the enemy by this means. There were two practical consequences of the blackout. One we shall look at shortly. First, though, we must consider the immediate effect of plunging the country into darkness. The blackout was instituted a couple of days before the declaration of war and strictly enforced on the Sunday evening of the day that Neville Chamberlain made his famous speech to the nation, informing them that their country was now at war. It took a little while for everybody to adhere strictly to the new requirements, and as usual some people were a little more officious and keen to enforce regulations than others. One such person was 25-year-old P.C. Southworth, who was on the day following the declaration of war patrolling London's West End between Regent's Park and Oxford Street. As he walked along Harley Street after dusk, he noticed a light showing in a fourth-floor window. Unable to persuade anybody to answer his determined knocking on the front door, Southworth decided to climb up the outside of the building, get through the window and extinguish the light himself. Gripping his electric torch between his teeth, P.C. Southworth began to climb up a drain pipe. From there he was able to get onto a ledge on the first floor, which gave him access to another pipe. In this precarious fashion, in complete darkness, apart from the light of his torch, the young police officer succeeded in reaching the third floor, and it was there that disaster struck, for he lost his hold upon the pipe and plummeted down to the street below. He died of his injuries a short while later. This tragic accident was the first recorded death in Britain to occur as a direct result of the Second World War. Police Constable Southworth might have been the first person to die because of the blackout, but he certainly wasn't the last. The lack of any kind of artificial light at night made the streets horribly dangerous for pedestrians. There were all sorts of accidents, from tripping over the curb to falling in canals, but the greatest risk was that posed by motor vehicles. It had been thought especially important that cars, buses and trams showed no lights, because otherwise the roads of Britain would have been clearly and obviously delineated from the air by strings of glowing beads of light. For people crossing the road, though, the new situation was a nightmare. The last 4 months of 1939 saw a 100% increase in deaths on the road in Britain, as compared with the figure for the same period in the previous year. The great majority of those killed were pedestrians. The increase in fatalities was not evenly distributed across the whole country. In Glasgow, for instance, 3 times as many people were killed in the closing months of 1939. Wilfred Trotter, the King's surgeon, wrote to the British Medical Journal and observed that by frightening the nation into blackout regulations, the Luftwaffe has been able to kill 600 British citizens a month without ever taking to the air. If the King's surgeon was correct in his assertion that 600 people a year were being killed by the blackout, and nobody challenged him on this point, then this suggests that between the outbreak of war in September 1939 and the beginning of the Blitz a year later, the blackout had already caused over 7,000 deaths. A survey carried out in January 1940 found that 1 person in 5 claimed to have suffered injury of some kind because of the blackout. The thing with the blackout was that although it was a complete waste of time, it made people think that they were doing something useful and helpful. It puts me in mind a little bit of the lockdown regulations that people followed so religiously because they thought that something so inconvenient and awkward had to be good for them. That's how people felt about the blackout. They welcomed it because it made their lives difficult, and so it must be a good thing and a thing to make them safer. The other point about the blackout is, of course, this, that because the bombers flying over wanted to bomb strategic targets such as railway marshalling yards, factories, uh, other industrial targets, transport targets, they couldn't see them clearly, so they just dropped the bombs in the general area, which meant that an awful lot of bombs fell on residential streets and so on. Without the blackout, the death toll in the Blitz would have been much lower because the Luftwaffe would have concentrated their bombs only on particular targets. The terrible destruction that we saw in ordinary streets during the Blitz wouldn't have occurred. It's curious, it does put me in mind of the lockdown, really, because everybody there followed instructions. It was inconvenient, it was annoying, but it made us feel safe. And that's what the blackout did to people as well. It's a psychological phenomenon rather than anything to do with epidemics or wars.